This video is for reading 22. It's entitled Queers Without Money. They're everywhere, but we refuse to see them. And it's written by Amber Hollabow. It's worth noting that this is one of the few non-academic first-person narrative essays that I will assign in this course. And so because this is not an academic, the same type of reliance on theoretical frameworks or empiricism where the person has collected data, obviously that is not there. So instead, it's really just important that you maybe actually read that about author section so you know who Amber Hollabow is and what her intentions are behind this piece. Although, it's a pretty short little essay, and I think it becomes very quickly apparent, what her goal or her intention is, in terms of writing this. So it opens with this discussion about her family and her upbringing. And after, kind of going through, some of her experiences from childhood and where she grew up, she describes her identity on page 235 ultimately as being a high femme, mixed race, white trash lesbian. Um, and one thing to just kind of note about this identity description is, it very clearly relates to the focus of our course. This idea that we embody intersectional identities, that we all are a mix of social identities that are pertinent and shape how other people see us, as well as how we perceive ourselves in the context of those multiple identities. So, she emphasizes, her gender, her race, her social class, as well as her sexual orientation, in that statement about her identity. And, particularly in this essay, it is about her social class and that intersection between social class and sexual orientation that she is highlighting, because she goes on to discuss, in general in this country, we have had an erasure of the group of people she refers to as poor queers. And this is, maybe due to some of the early research which overly relied on, the coastal elites and our understanding of homosexuality and sexual minorities largely through this lens of the coastal elites, and so it led us to conclude that gays are, more highly educated and are more well off than the average population. So some bad sampling led to some overgeneralizations and some incorrect stereotypes. And then certainly the role of the media has played, right? So if you think about particularly, some of our portrayals of gays and lesbians, in the 90s and the early aughts, when we first started to see some presence of members of the LGBT community on TV, a lot of times they were on people that had a certain amount of social class privilege. They also were largely white. And so, for example, your book highlights, Will and Grace, and the gay men that make up Will's social circle. So the media also kind of contributed to that erasure of poor queers. And so the essay goes on to discuss the impact this myth has on both people who don't identify as queer as well as those who do. Obviously, the myth that that homosexuals are better off than the average American, as the author notes, can definitely factor in some resentments among other types of minorities, as well as just a perceived sense that the marginalization and the stigmatization faced by homosexuals can't be that serious if they're doing so well in society. It leads to people to downplaying the oppression faced by people who are sexual minorities, because of the assumption that they are all or they're mostly, financially stable, upwardly mobile. And even people who do identify as queer and know that not all queer people are well off, it impacts them as well. And she notes that oftentimes poverty is treated like a queer secret. People who know that they are poor and are queer, they feel an even greater sense of shame and stigma for, supposedly not fitting the model type of what a gay person should be, what they should have in society. And then, also people, even if they know it's not true, the fact that this is a more positive stereotype in regards to homosexuality means that they sometimes allow it to be perpetuated, and they don't push back against it as aggressively as they maybe would if the stereotype was more negative. Um, but as the author notes, the larger impacts this has, particularly on impoverished queer individuals, has to be addressed because they have some unique hardships that they face, in regards to what resources are available for them to access in terms of, housing or government assistance, free healthcare, to be poor and queer, especially when some of that assistance is predicated on, being cisgender man or woman, or having children, and being a mother or a father, and having, your biological children to get access to some forms of assistance, means that a lot of programs are either not available to poor queer individuals, or are very limited or very hard to access. And like I said, added to that, just the role of shame, that in addition to being doubly, triply oppressed and marginalized. And so, for this reason, the author ends this article with a call of action to gay activists within the LGBT political movement, right? She's emphasizing that, you know, poor queers exist, and they are, overlooked and ignored, not just by, people outside of the LGBT community, but also people within the LGBT community. And she's really just kind of emphasizing that this is, a shame and problematic, because these are individuals within that community who definitely need assistance and need help. And so, because there was no other reading where it was a good place to kind of insert this history, what I'm now going to provide is a little bit of history about LGBT activism, that Hollabaugh kind of, vaguely alludes to, but I would like for you to know in more concrete detail. So this is a little history lesson about sexual orientation and activism. So as discussed in a previous reading, heterosexuality and homosexuality are relatively recent concepts. They were invented during the Victorian era by Victorian era sexologists. And these new labels created categories that then regulated our behavior, because for the first time, sexual identities were created, right? Before that, it was like, okay, people engaged in behavior that was more or less accepted, but now it kind of became linked to a person's identity. So now we've created identities that become more or less accepted. Um, and so, as I note, there were a variety of sexual acts people engaged in before this, but these acts did not define them as a person. And now, once these terms were created, now they were. And so by the early 20th century, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder or disease, by the American Psychiatric Association. And they actually listed it in the DSM, which is their diagnostic and statistical, module, as such. And that's, of course, this is the book, this is the text that psychologists and psychiatric people who work in that field, that they refer to in order to diagnose people. So this became a diagnosable mental disorder. And, this was the case, largely for, almost 100 years, um, or not quite 100 years, maybe 70 years. But then we see the gay rights movement kind of start building up steam in the late 1960s. And what's really key here is the gay rights movement. They posited that the problem isn't homosexuality, but discrimination against gay people, right? So this was the first kind of real targeted pushback between, against an identity being labeled and treated as being deviant. And although, there may not be like one clear moment where we can say, aha, this is where the gay rights movement began. Certainly, the Stonewall riots have consistently been pointed to as being a significant kind of precursor or jumpstart to the movement. And this was during the summer of 1969, and it occurred in New York. And basically, it was just a series of violent skirmishes between homosexuals as well as transgender individuals against the police, against what they felt like had been unfair targeting of the kind of bars and establishments that they frequented by the police for raids and rounding people up and putting people in jail, largely just due to their gender and their sexual identities. And so, during it finally kind of reached this boiling point. And, there was this series of, taking it to the street skirmishes with the police, which, became a big news story and shone a light on some of the discrimination that sexual and gender minorities faced. And coming out of the Stonewall riots, the kind of first kind of like large political activist group called the Gay Liberation Front was formed later that year. If you've ever heard the phrase "gay is good," this is a slogan that comes from that group that they, would put on signs and shirts and have at marches. And the Gay Liberation Front, the gay rights movement, they definitely had some successes going into the 70s. For instance, they were able to get homosexuality declassified as a mental disorder. So it was removed from the DSM in 1973. And now it's almost the opposite, right? Because now we actually see it as a mental health issue if you fail to come to terms with your sexual orientation. So it's not your sexual orientation that is the mental disorder, but your inability to kind of come to terms with whatever that sexual orientation may be. You see the first openly gay politician elected in San Francisco in the late 70s. You have the emergence of gay neighborhoods where you have like a preponderance of individuals and their allies who live in a specific area and are outwardly gay. You see these neighborhoods pop up, not just in places like New York and San Francisco, but you also start to see them in places like Chicago and Atlanta and cities where there hadn't necessarily been a thriving gay scene until this time. And then they also kind of introduced the term homophobia and kind of get that, recognized as being a societal ill, a social issue similar to sexism and racism, in both academic as well as non-academic circles. But a lot of this activism that was building in the 70s does become blunted by the AIDS epidemic that, really takes over in the 80s. And so, AIDS is the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and it's caused by HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus. And it's often, but not always, sexually transmitted. There are other ways of getting it, especially in those early days, in regards to like blood transfusions. And even today, of course, IV needle usage, sharing needles can also transmit the disease. But back then, similar to today, it is most often transmitted through sexual sexual acts. Looking back on it now, it is clear that the US government was slow to respond to the AIDS crisis. And people even say that it wasn't given serious attention until the epidemic began to spread into the heterosexual population in significant numbers. Back when it was largely only killing homosexuals, primarily gay men, it was seen as being largely limited to the gay male population. And you can even see in some early scientific academic articles that it was referred to as GRID, gay related immune deficiency, where they link to the disease actually to gayness as opposed to certain types of behaviors. Now, since the 1980s, there have been important advances made in treating AIDS and HIV, and today many individuals can live with the disease longer and remain healthier. There are types of therapies and medications that really improve the health of people with HIV, as well as reduces and diminishes the likelihood of transmitting it. However, AIDS is still the most lethal of all the STIs, and um, people do still transmit HIV, and HIV does still turn to AIDS. And you can see some kind of numbers there, in regards to new cases and where, how those new cases came about. Um, and so, although the issue that we now most often associate with gay rights, which is, of course, marriage, marital rights, it really wasn't a prominent issue until the 1990s, because so much of the 80s and early 90s was focused on that HIV/AIDS epidemic. But in the 90s, the issue of marital rights did become a prominent issue. And a lot of it was spurred by the passage of the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996. Which basically defined marriage as being between a man and a woman, as well as the military's policies of don't ask, don't tell, which, it meant that, it wasn't necessarily that you couldn't be, gay in the military, but it meant that you had to hide your sexuality. And if you're like, well, why is that such a big deal? Well, think about, if you ever know anyone in the military, think about all of the benefits that come with being an active military person for both yourself as well as your family. Now, if you are gay and your family is with a same sex partner, that literally meant that your family, your partner, is now cut off from all of those rights that other people's families and partners had access to, even though you are serving in the military, much like a heterosexual person. So, between these two policies, this started to spark some activism around the issue of marital rights. And and there's almost over a decade of that, with some states and some cities having, being more open, being more progressive around this issue, and there being some local or even state level wins. But in terms of the federal level, it's really with the Obama administration that we start to see some large scale changes. 2009, President Obama declared that DOMA was unconstitutional, and the DOJ will no longer defend it in court, which means when individuals then sued their states for not letting them marry, the states could now no longer expect the federal government to take up their cause and defend their claim in the federal courts. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court basically says that DOMA is unconstitutional. And once they did that, some states then, this really reduces the legal argument for why states cannot allow people to marry on the basis of sex orientation. And so in 2014, if you look at like what's going on in the country, it's prohibited in 33 states and it's permitted in 17 states and the District of Columbia. And whenever, the country is split like this around a social issue, you can expect that the Supreme Court is going to have to weigh in, because we are the United States of America. It really just creates too much individual as well as bureaucratic headache administrative headache when you don't know if a person's marriage is going to be acknowledged and respected as they move state to state, because people do, of course, move state to state. And imagine how stressful it would be if you moved from Massachusetts to Texas for a job, um, and you were legally married in Massachusetts to your same sex partner, but now here you are in Texas and you're not legally married and you lose all of those rights and protections. So, unsurprisingly, the Supreme Court did take up this issue yet again in 2015. And in the case Oberfell versus Hodges, basically the Supreme Court said states have to allow same sex couples to marry, and they must recognize same sex marriages from other states, right? So in the same way that, in Loving versus Virginia, states, the Supreme Court basically said you can't prevent people from marrying because they're of different races. Now you have the Supreme Court saying you can't prevent people from marrying because they're the same sex. And it's worth noting, or at that time, there's about 390,000 married same-sex couples, but another 1.2 million were living in same-sex domestic partnerships. So this case definitely impacted a lot of people. And in terms of how this issue was perceived by the larger public, it's worth noting at the time that this decision was made, the country was almost split 60-40 in terms of people's level of support for marital rights for people in same-sex couples. And since this has become just kind of an established right, a constitutional right in this country, we've seen approval rates around this issue increase. Because once something is an established right, usually this means that for a lot of people, it kind of becomes a non-issue and it isn't something that they remain virulently opposed to. Although, certainly, considering it in terms of intersectionality, there are definitely people based on their religion, based on where they live in the country, based on their age in particular, where they are more or less accepting of the marital rights of sexual minorities. And so the question that I encourage you to consider based on the reading: the stereotype that gays are rich slash well off is an example of what many would call a positive stereotype. But the author points out the harm it still does. Do you agree with her that there are still negative consequences to positive stereotypes? Do you think that the fact it is considered positive might be why some members of the queer community are less adamant about resisting it as compared to more harmful stereotypes?